In the grand halls of Greystone Manor, a priceless emerald locket vanishes during a glittering family gathering, plunging the Wentworths into a web of suspicion. Was it Charles, the ambitious heir, desperate for funds? Clara, the nervous maid with a hidden past? Dr. Hayes, the scholar obsessed with the locket's history? Or Beatrice, the charming cousin masking a secret? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the truth. As clues emerge, a scuff mark, a fleck of wax, a shady village deal, the thief's desperation comes to light, leading to a dramatic confrontation that restores the locket and mends a fractured family. Dive into a tale of greed, guilt, and redemption, where every glance hides a motive. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Greystone Manor. The late October sun cast long shadows across the lawns of Greystone Manor, its golden rays gilding the ancient ivy that clung to the stone facade like a protective shroud. The air carried a crisp bite, and the faint rustle of leaves underfoot mingled with the hum of voices spilling from the open windows of the great house. Inside, Lady Eleanor Wentworth, a sprightly figure at 70, presided over her birthday celebration with the quiet dignity of one accustomed to command. Around her neck gleamed the family's prized heirloom, an antique locket, its gold surface etched with delicate filigree and set with emeralds that caught the candlelight like tiny green flames. The locket, passed down through generations, was said to hold a lock of hair from Eleanor's great-grandmother, a woman of mysterious beauty, whose portrait hung in the hall. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed armchair near the fireplace, observed the gathering with her usual unobtrusive keenness. Her knitting needles moved rhythmically, producing a soft click that went unnoticed amid the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. She had been invited as a courtesy, a nod to her long friendship with Eleanor's late sister, Margaret, whose sharp wit had once rivaled Miss Marple's own. Now, as her eyes roamed the room, she took in the cast of characters with the precision of a playwright studying her players. Charles Wentworth, Eleanor's nephew and heir, stood by the grand piano, his lean frame clad in a tailored suit that bore the faintest signs of wear at the cuffs. His smile was polished, but his eyes darted restlessly, as if calculating the cost of every chandelier in the room. He spoke with animated gestures to a group of distant cousins, yet there was a strain in his voice, a note of impatience that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple noted how he glanced at Eleanor's locket, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his guests with renewed vigor. Clara, the young maid, moved through the crowd with a tray of sherry glasses, her movements swift but not entirely graceful. Her dark hair was pinned neatly under a cap, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she offered drinks to the guests. She was new to Greystone, Miss Marple recalled, having joined the household only 6 months prior. Her deference was impeccable, yet there was something in her downcast eyes, a flicker of unease, perhaps, that caught Miss Marple's attention. When Clara passed near Eleanor, she seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary, her gaze brushing the locket before she hurried on. Dr. Lionel Hayes, a guest invited for his reputed expertise in antiquities, stood near the dining room's French doors, his bearded face alight with enthusiasm as he discoursed on the locket's craftsmanship to a bored-looking aunt. His voice carried a scholarly cadence, and his fingers gestured as if tracing the locket's filigree in the air. "A remarkable piece," he was saying, likely French, late 18th century, with emeralds of exceptional clarity. His eyes, however, strayed to Eleanor, who was laughing softly at a cousin's jest. Miss Marple wondered if his interest was purely academic, or if the locket's value stirred something deeper. Beatrice Lyle, Eleanor's distant cousin, hovered on the fringes of the gathering, her cigarette holder poised like a conductor's baton. Her dress, a bold shade of crimson, clashed with the manor's muted elegance, and her laughter rang out a touch too loudly, drawing curious glances. She was a woman of middle age, her face carefully made up, yet there was a brittleness to her, as if her gaiety were a mask stretched thin. When she caught Miss Marple's eye, she offered a quick smile, but her fingers tightened around her glass, and she turned away to light another cigarette. As the evening progressed, the guests moved to the dining room, where a long table gleamed with silver and crystal. Eleanor, at the head, was the picture of graciousness, though Miss Marple noted a faint crease in her brow when Charles whispered something to her. The meal was served with precision: roast pheasant, glazed vegetables, and a claret that drew murmurs of approval. Clara flitted in and out, her tray now laden with plates, her movements more hurried than before. Dr. Hayes, seated near Eleanor, leaned forward to compliment the locket again, his voice carrying over the table. Beatrice, across from him, toyed with her fork, her eyes fixed on her plate. It was during the serving of the dessert, a delicate lemon soufflé, that Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. A gasp escaped her, sharp and sudden, silencing the table. "The locket," she said, her voice trembling but controlled. "It's gone." The room froze. Charles half rose from his chair, his face flushed. Clara, standing by the sideboard, nearly dropped a spoon. Dr. Hayes's brows lifted, his hand pausing mid-gesture. Beatrice's cigarette trembled in its holder, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward. Miss Marple, her knitting now stilled, watched them all, her mind already sifting through the evening's details like threads in a tangled skein. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The drawing-room of Greystone Manor, bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, seemed to hold its breath as the guests reconvened after Eleanor's startling announcement. The air, heavy with the scent of beeswax polish and fading roses, carried a palpable tension, as if the very walls were waiting for the next revelation. Lady Eleanor Wentworth, seated in a high-backed chair by the hearth, maintained a remarkable composure, though her fingers, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed a flicker of distress. The antique locket, that cherished heirloom of gold and emeralds, had vanished from her neck sometime during the evening's festivities, and the weight of its absence hung over the room, like a storm cloud. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, occupied a modest seat near a corner table, her presence almost overlooked by the others. Her eyes, bright and unyielding behind her spectacles, moved from face to face, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the fleeting glances, the unspoken accusations that danced beneath the surface of civility. The fire crackled, casting shadows that flickered across the ornate plasterwork of the ceiling, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm, a counterpoint to the murmurs of the gathered company. Charles Wentworth, the heir, stood by the mantelpiece, one hand gripping the edge as if to steady himself. His face, usually so composed, was flushed with a mixture of indignation and unease. "It's preposterous," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "The locket was on your neck at the start of dinner, Aunt Eleanor. I saw it myself. It can't have just disappeared." His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on each suspect, as if daring them to contradict him. Miss Marple noted the way his jaw tightened when his gaze passed over Clara, the maid, who stood near the doorway, her hands clasped before her like a penitent. Eleanor, her silver hair catching the firelight, raised a hand to silence her nephew. "It was there during the main course," she said, her tone measured but firm. "I felt its weight, as I always do. The clasp is old, yes, but secure. I had it checked only last month. It couldn't have simply fallen off." Her words carried a quiet authority, and Miss Marple admired her restraint, for the locket was no mere trinket. It was a symbol of the Wentworth lineage, a tangible link to a past steeped in pride and tragedy. Clara, the maid, shifted her weight, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her plain black dress and starched apron gave her an air of unobtrusive efficiency, but her hands betrayed her nerves, twisting together as if seeking reassurance. "Shall I search the dining room again, my lady?" she offered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or perhaps the servants' quarters. It might have slipped somewhere." The hesitation in her words was slight, but Miss Marple caught it as she caught the quick glance Clara cast toward the door, as if longing to escape the scrutiny of the room. Dr. Lionel Hayes, the antiquities expert, sat forward in his chair, his bearded face a study in concern. "A piece like that," he said, his voice rich with the cadence of a lecturer, "is not easily lost. The craftsmanship is exquisite, French, I'd wager, from the late 18th century. The emeralds alone would make it a target for a discerning thief." His fingers traced an invisible pattern in the air, as if recreating the locket's filigree. Miss Marple noted his enthusiasm, which seemed to border on proprietary, and recalled how he had lingered near Eleanor during dinner, his eyes fixed on the locket with an intensity that went beyond scholarly interest. Beatrice Lyle, the cousin, perched on the edge of a sofa, her crimson dress a stark contrast to the room's muted tones. She held a cigarette in a long holder, its tip glowing faintly as she inhaled. "This is all rather dramatic, isn't it?" she said, her voice light but edged with a tremor. "Perhaps it's just misplaced. These old houses are full of nooks and crannies." Her laugh was brittle, and she flicked ash into a nearby tray with a gesture that seemed too deliberate. Miss Marple observed the way Beatrice's eyes darted to Charles, then to Clara, before settling on the fire, as if seeking refuge in its glow. Eleanor turned to Miss Marple, her expression softening. "Jane, you've always had a knack for seeing things others miss. What do you make of this?" The question was posed with a quiet trust, and the room's attention shifted to the unassuming figure in the corner. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she smiled faintly, her mind already sifting through the evening's events like a gardener turning soil. "It's far too early to say," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But a locket doesn't vanish without help, and we must consider the how and the when before we leap to the who. Could you tell us, Eleanor, exactly when you last noticed it?" Her question was deceptively simple, but Miss Marple knew that details, like the stitches in her knitting, could unravel the most tangled mysteries. Eleanor frowned, her brow creasing as she retraced her steps. "I felt it during the soup course," she said. "I remember because Charles complimented it, and I touched it then. By the main course, I was distracted. Mrs. Harrow was telling me about her son's engagement, but I'm certain it was still there. It was during dessert, when I reached for my napkin, that I noticed it was gone. Her hand moved to her throat, as if seeking the familiar weight. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the timeline. The soup course had been served at 7:30, the main course around 8, and dessert just before 9. The locket had vanished in that hour, a narrow window in a crowded room. "And no one left the dining room during that time?" she asked, her tone mild but probing. Charles cleared his throat. "Well, people were in and out, weren't they? Guests mingling, servants clearing plates. It was a lively evening." His words were casual, but his fingers tightened on the mantelpiece, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. Clara, still by the door, spoke up. "I was in and out, ma'am, clearing the dishes, but I didn't notice anything unusual." Her voice was steady now, but her eyes remained fixed on the floor, and Miss Marple wondered what lay behind her guarded demeanor. Dr. Hayes stroked his beard, his eyes narrowing. "I stepped out briefly to fetch a cigar from my coat in the hall. Couldn't have been more than a minute or two. The locket was still there when I returned. I'm sure of it." His certainty was convincing, but Miss Marple recalled the exact moment he had excused himself, just as the pheasant was being carved. His absence had been brief, but long enough, perhaps, for a deft hand. Beatrice stubbed out her cigarette with a sharp twist. "I was dancing with Mr. Harrow after the main course," she said, her tone almost defiant. "Hardly the time to go pilfering jewelry." Her words were met with silence, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand trembled as she reached for another cigarette. The room fell quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant chime of a clock striking 10. Miss Marple's needles resumed their work, and she spoke again, her voice soft but deliberate. "It might be wise to search the dining room and the adjacent passages," she suggested. "Not that I expect to find the locket lying about, but there may be something, a trace, perhaps, that could guide us." Her words were met with nods, though the enthusiasm was tepid, and Charles took charge, directing Clara to fetch lanterns and organize the servants. The search was thorough, but fruitless. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and heavy damask curtains, yielded nothing. No glint of gold, no stray emerald. The sideboard, the chairs, even the folds of the tablecloth were examined, but the locket was gone. Miss Marple, following at a discreet distance, paid particular attention to the side door leading to the servants' passage. It was a narrow, unassuming portal, often used by the staff to move unobtrusively between rooms. She knelt, her joints protesting faintly, and peered at the floor. There, in the faint light, she spotted a smudge on the parquet, a scuff mark, barely noticeable, and beside it, a tiny fleck of green wax, as if from a candle. She straightened, her mind turning over the possibilities. The dining table had been adorned with green tapers, their wax prone to dripping. Had someone brushed against them in haste, leaving this trace? Charles, returning from the search, noticed her interest. "Found something, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Only a thought," she replied, her smile enigmatic. "The smallest things can tell, the largest stories, don't you find?" She said no more, but her eyes lingered on the door, which led to a passage connecting to the garden, and beyond that, the village road. A convenient route, she mused, for someone wishing to slip away unnoticed. The guests, weary and unsettled, began to disperse, and Eleanor rose, her composure unshaken. "I trust we'll get to the bottom of this," she said, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. "Jane, will you stay a few days? Your insight would be invaluable." The request was both a plea and a command, and Miss Marple inclined her head, her mind already weaving a pattern from the evening's threads. As the others retired, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her knitting a pretext for reflection. Charles's restlessness, Clara's unease, Hayes's fascination, Beatrice's brittleness, each was a piece of the puzzle, but none yet fit together. The locket, she knew, was more than a jewel. It was a motive, a temptation, a secret waiting to be uncovered. She thought of her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature played out in simpler settings, yet was no less complex. Greystone Manor, with its grandeur and its shadows, was merely a larger stage for the same drama. The fire burned low, and Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. Tomorrow she would begin, in earnest, speaking to each suspect, observing their words and silences. For now, she would let the night settle, knowing that secrets, like embers, often glowed brightest in the dark. Chapter 3. The Heir's Ambition. The morning after the locket's disappearance dawned gray and chill, with a mist clinging to the grounds of Greystone Manor like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat in the conservatory, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the patter of rain against the glass. The conservatory, with its profusion of ferns and orchids, offered a quiet retreat from the manor's bustle, and Miss Marple had chosen it deliberately for her first conversation of the day. She had sent a discreet note to Charles Wentworth, requesting a moment of his time over tea, and now she waited, her eyes scanning the mist-draped gardens as her mind turned over the events of the previous evening. Charles arrived promptly, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in a tweed jacket and polished shoes, but Miss Marple noted the faint shadows under his eyes, suggesting a night of little sleep. He carried himself with the air of a man accustomed to command, yet there was a brittleness to his smile as he greeted her. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a wicker chair opposite her, "I hope you've some magic up your sleeve. This business with the locket is a damned nuisance." His tone was light, but his fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the armrest. Miss Marple poured tea from a silver pot, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "It is indeed troubling," she said, her voice gentle but with a hint of steel beneath. "A family heirloom carries more than monetary value, doesn't it? It's a piece of history, of identity. I imagine it means a great deal to you, as Eleanor's heir." Her words were a probe, soft but precise, and she watched his reaction over the rim of her teacup. Charles's smile tightened, and he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Of course it does," he said. "The locket's been in the family for generations. Aunt Eleanor's worn it at every major gathering since I was a boy. It's symbolic, I suppose, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about its worth. You know how it is with old estates like this, always bleeding money." His candor was calculated, Miss Marple thought, as if he wished to appear forthright while revealing only what served him. She nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Greystone is a grand place, but I imagine it's costly to maintain. Modernizing such an estate must require considerable funds." Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Charles's fingers paused in their drumming. He laughed, a short, dry sound. "You've hit the nail on the head, Miss Marple. The roof leaks, the plumbing's a nightmare, and don't get me started on the taxes. I've plans to turn part of the estate into a hotel. Tasteful, mind you, with historical tours and such. It could breathe new life into Greystone. But banks aren't keen to lend without collateral, and, well, he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window, where the mist swirled like a living thing. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloging his words. "And the locket," she said, "with its emeralds and gold. It would fetch a tidy sum at auction, wouldn't it? Enough, perhaps, to fund a portion of your plans." Her voice was mild, but the question hung in the air like a challenge. Charles's eyes snapped back to her, and for a moment a flicker of defensiveness crossed his face. "I'd never sell it," he said quickly. "It's Aunt Eleanor's pride and joy. Besides, it's not mine to sell. Not yet, anyway." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, and Miss Marple noted the slight strain in his voice, as if he were guarding a thought he dared not voice. She changed tack, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "Of course, I understand. Family loyalty runs deep. Tell me, Charles, where were you during dinner last night? It's helpful to piece together everyone's movements, you see, to narrow down when the locket might have been taken." Her question was innocent enough, but she watched him closely, her needles never faltering. Charles shifted in his chair, uncrossing his legs. "I was in the dining room the whole time," he said, "mingling, chatting with the Harrows and that dreadful bore, Cousin Philip. I might have stepped to the sideboard for a drink at some point, but I didn't leave the room. Too many people to keep an eye on." His words were smooth, but there was a vagueness to them, a lack of specificity that piqued Miss Marple's interest. She recalled seeing him near the sideboard during the main course, but his back had been to the table, and for a moment he had been out of her line of sight. "And you didn't notice anything unusual?" she pressed, her voice as gentle as ever. "No one lingering near Eleanor, perhaps, or behaving oddly?" He shook his head, but his fingers resumed their restless drumming. "Nothing stands out. It was a busy evening, people coming and going, servants bustling about. Clara was in and out, clearing plates. Dr. Hayes was prattling on about the locket as usual. Beatrice was flitting around, playing the social butterfly. It's hard to keep track of everyone." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes flicked to the door, as if he wished to escape the conversation. She set her teacup down, her movements precise. "It is curious, isn't it, how a locket can vanish in a room full of people, almost as if someone planned it carefully." Her words were light, but they carried a weight that made Charles pause, his hand stilling on the armrest. "Planned?" he echoed, his brow furrowing. "You think someone targeted it? That's a grim thought, Miss Marple." He leaned forward now, his voice lowering. "If you're suggesting one of us took it, I'd wager on an outsider. A servant, perhaps, or someone who slipped in during the chaos of the party." His suggestion was plausible, but Miss Stewart and Miss Marple noted the quickness with which he shifted blame, a tactic as old as human nature itself. She tilted her head as if considering his theory. "An outsider, perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "though it would take a bold thief to steal from a crowded room. Tell me, Charles, have you had any trouble with the staff? Anyone who might hold a grudge?" Her question was casual, but she watched his reaction, curious to see if he would seize the opportunity to deflect further. He shrugged, his expression guarded. "The staff seem loyal enough. Clara's new, but she came with a glowing reference. The others have been with us for years. I can't imagine any of them risking their place for a stunt like this." His words were reasonable, but there was a tightness in his jaw, and Miss Marple wondered if he was protecting someone or himself. As the conversation drew to a close, Charles rose, his smile returning but strained. "I'll leave you to your knitting, Miss Marple," he said, his tone striving for levity. "I trust you'll work your usual magic. Aunt Eleanor's counting on it." He bowed slightly and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Miss Marple remained in the conservatory, her needles moving steadily as she reflected. Charles's ambition was clear. Greystone Manor was his inheritance, but also his burden. The locket's value could ease his financial straits, yet he had denied any intent to sell it. His alibi was vague, his movements unconfirmed for a critical moment during dinner. And there was that frayed cuff on his suit, a small detail that spoke of stretched resources. She thought of her nephew, Raymond, whose modern ideas often clashed with tradition, and how ambition could blind a man to the cost of his actions. Charles, she suspected, was not telling her everything, but whether his secret was theft or something else, she could not yet say. The rain had ceased, and a weak sun broke through the mist, casting a pale light over the gardens. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Charles was a man with much to gain, and perhaps much to hide. She would speak to the others, piece by piece, until the pattern of the truth emerged. Chapter 4. The Maid's Secret. The afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Greystone Manor's morning room, casting a muted glow over the polished oak furniture and the faded Persian rug. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands, as she waited for Clara, the maid, to join her. The room, with its scent of lavender and old wood, was a quiet haven from the manor's undercurrents of suspicion, and Miss Marple had chosen it for its intimacy, hoping it would put the young woman at ease. She had sent a polite request via the housekeeper, asking Clara to assist with a minor task, polishing the silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece, knowing the girl's duties would bring her close enough for conversation without arousing alarm. Clara entered, her steps soft but hesitant, carrying a cloth and a tin of polish. Her dark hair was tucked neatly under her cap, and her black dress, crisp with starch, gave her an air of quiet efficiency. Yet Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she set to work, her movements precise but betraying a nervous energy. The firelight caught the edge of her apron, and Miss Marple saw a faint stain. Grease, perhaps from the kitchen, marred its pristine white. A small detail, but one that suggested Clara had been rushed or distracted. "Good afternoon, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and unassuming, as if they were merely neighbors chatting over a garden fence. "You've had a busy time with all this upset about the locket, haven't you? It must be trying, working in a house where such things happen." Her tone was sympathetic, inviting confidence without pressing too hard. Clara glanced up, her brown eyes wide for a moment, before dropping back to the candlestick she was polishing. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "It's a terrible thing, Lady Eleanor losing her locket. She's been so kind to me, and I'd hate to think anyone here would do such a thing." Her words were earnest, but there was a catch in her voice, a hint of something unspoken that made Miss Marple's needles pause briefly. She resumed knitting, her fingers moving with the ease of long habit. "You've not been at Greystone long, have you?" she asked, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Only a few months, I believe. It must feel quite different from your last place." Her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching Clara's reaction. Clara's cloth slowed, and she nodded. "6 months, ma'am. I came from Lord Ashby's estate in Kent. It was smaller, quieter. Greystones, grand, but there's so much to keep up with." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened around the candlestick, and Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders stiffened, as if bracing for scrutiny. "Lord Ashby?" Miss Marple repeated, her tone musing. "I believe I've heard of him. A fine family by all accounts. They must have been sorry to lose you." She smiled, her expression one of kindly interest, but her mind was alert, recalling a snippet of gossip from her friend Mrs. Bantry about a theft at Ashby Hall some years back. A silver tray, never recovered. "You came with a good reference, I'm sure." Clara flushed, her cheeks pink against the pallor of her face. "Yes, ma'am. Lady Ashby was kind enough to write one. I've always done my best to give satisfaction." Her words were quick, almost rehearsed, and she resumed polishing with a vigor that seemed more about distraction than necessity. Miss Marple tucked this away, like a skein of wool set aside for later use. The fire crackled, sending a spark leaping onto the hearth, and Clara started, her cloth slipping briefly. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "It must be difficult, being new and caught up in this business with the locket. You were so busy during dinner last night, weren't you? In and out, clearing plates, keeping everything in order. I don't know how you manage it all." Her compliment was sincere, but it carried a subtle invitation to share more. Clara's eyes flicked to the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers, before she answered. "It was a busy night, ma'am. I was back and forth between the dining room and the kitchen. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, though. Everyone was talking and laughing, and I was just trying to keep up." Her voice was earnest, but there was a slight quiver in it, and Miss Marple recalled seeing her slip into the hallway just as the dessert course was served, her tray empty and her steps hurried. "You didn't notice anyone near Lady Eleanor, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. "Someone who might have been close enough to touch her locket? It's such a delicate thing, isn't it, to take something so personal without being noticed." Clara's hands stilled, and for a moment she seemed to hold her breath. "No, ma'am," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was too busy to notice much. I saw Mr. Charles talking to her, and Dr. Hayes was nearby, going on about the locket's history. Miss Beatrice was at the other end of the table, I think, but I wasn't watching closely." Her words were careful, and Miss Marple noted the way. Her eyes darted to the side, as if avoiding a truth she wasn't ready to share. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Of course, you had your hands full. It's a wonder you manage it all, with so many guests. Did you happen to use the side door to the servants' passage during dinner? It's such a convenient route, I imagine, for coming and going without disturbing the guests." Her question was posed lightly, but she watched Clara closely, remembering the scuff mark and the fleck of green wax near that very door. Clara's flush deepened, and her cloth moved faster over the candlestick. "Yes, ma'am, I used it a few times. It's quicker to get to the kitchen that way. But I didn't see anything unusual, I swear." Her voice rose slightly, and she caught herself lowering her eyes. "I just want to do my job and not cause trouble." The plea in her tone was genuine, But Miss Marple sensed a thread of fear, as if Clara were guarding a secret she dared not reveal. The room fell quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "You're a good girl, Clara," she said kindly, "and I'm sure you want to help Lady Eleanor. If you remember anything, even the smallest thing, you'll let me know, won't you? Sometimes it's the little details that matter most." Her smile was encouraging, but her eyes held a quiet intensity, and Clara nodded, her expression a mix of relief and unease. As Clara gathered her polishing supplies and left, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind turning over the conversation. Clara's nervousness was more than the natural anxiety of a servant under suspicion. Her quick glances, her trembling hands, the stain on her apron, all pointed to something amiss. Had she seen something during dinner, something she feared to admit? Or was there a deeper secret, perhaps tied to her past at Ashby Hall? Miss Marple thought of her own village, where a young housemaid once hid a lover's indiscretions out of loyalty, only to find herself entangled in a web of deceit. Clara, she suspected, was not the thief, but she knew more than she was saying. The morning room grew dim as the afternoon waned, and Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. She would speak to Dr. Hayes next, she decided, for his fascination with the locket was too pronounced to ignore. As she stepped into the corridor, the memory of Clara's flushed face lingered, a stitch in the pattern of this mystery that would need to be picked up again. Chapter 5. The Guest's Fascination. The gardens of Greystone Manor, though damp from the morning's mist, held a quiet charm in the late afternoon light. The rose bushes, their blooms fading with the season, lined a gravel path that wound toward a stone bench where Miss Jane Marple had arranged to meet Dr. Lionel Hayes. She had chosen the garden deliberately, knowing the open air might loosen tongues that felt constrained within the manor's walls. Her knitting bag rested beside her on the bench, a familiar prop that lent an air of harmlessness to her presence, though her mind was as sharp as the thorns on the roses nearby. Dr. Hayes approached with a brisk stride, his tweed coat and neatly trimmed beard giving him the look of a scholar out for a constitutional. His eyes, bright with intellectual curiosity, lit up as he spotted Miss Marple, and he offered a courteous nod. "Miss Marple," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "A pleasure to see you, though I wish it were under happier circumstances. This business with the locket is most distressing." His voice carried a practiced warmth, but Miss Marple noted a faint eagerness in his tone, as if the topic itself invigorated him. She smiled, her needles clicking softly, as she drew a length of pale blue wool from her bag. "Indeed, it's a puzzle," she said, her voice gentle but with a hint of purpose. "The locket is such a remarkable piece, isn't it? I understand you're quite knowledgeable about such things. Lady Eleanor mentioned your expertise in antiquities." Her compliment was light, but her eyes were watchful, catching the way Dr. Hayes's face brightened at the mention of the locket. "Oh, it's a splendid artifact," he said, leaning forward, his hands gesturing with the enthusiasm of a man in his element. "Late 18th century French, I'd wager, with emeralds of exceptional clarity, likely mined in Colombia, given their depth of color. The filigree work is exquisite, suggestive of a Parisian jeweler, perhaps one of the lesser-known artisans of the Louis XVI court." His words flowed like a lecture, and Miss Marple noted how his fingers traced invisible patterns in the air, as if he could see the locket before him. "It's not just the value," he continued, "but the history. Such pieces often carry stories, love affairs, betrayals, secrets locked within their clasps." Miss Marple nodded, her needles never faltering. "You seem to know it intimately," she said, her tone admiring but probing. "I suppose you had a chance to study it closely during dinner last night? You were seated near Lady Eleanor, weren't you?" Her question was posed with the innocence of idle curiosity. But she watched his reaction, noting the slight tightening of his jaw. "Yes, I was fortunate to have a good view," he said, his smile unwavering. "Eleanor was kind enough to let me examine it earlier in the evening, before the guests arrived. It's a rare privilege to handle such a piece. I was in the dining room all through dinner, save for a brief moment when I stepped out to fetch a cigar from my coat in the hall." His explanation was smooth, but Miss Marple recalled the timing of his absence. During the main course, just as the pheasant was being carved, a moment when the room was alive with chatter and distraction. "How fortunate you had that chance," she said, her voice as soft as the breeze stirring the roses. "It must be tempting for someone with your passion to possess such a treasure. Not in a dishonest way, of course, but as a collector, perhaps?" Her words were carefully chosen, a gentle nudge to test his response. Dr. Hayes laughed, a rich, hearty sound that echoed in the quiet garden. "Oh, I won't deny the temptation," he said, his eyes twinkling. "As a collector, one dreams of owning such pieces, but I'm a scholar first, Miss Marple. My joy comes from studying them, not hoarding them. Besides, the locket belongs with the Wentworths. It's their legacy." His words were polished, but Miss Marple noted a faint hesitation, a flicker of something in his eyes that suggested more than academic interest. She tilted her head, as if musing on his words. "It's curious, isn't it, how such a small thing can hold so much meaning? And yet it vanished in a room full of people. You didn't notice anything unusual during dinner, I suppose? Anyone lingering near Lady Eleanor, perhaps, or acting out of place?" Her question was casual, but her gaze was steady, searching for any crack in his composure. Dr. Hayes stroked his beard, his expression thoughtful. "It was a lively evening," he said. "I was deep in conversation with Mr. Harrow about Roman artifacts. Fascinating man, though not much for antiquities. I recall Charles moving about, playing the host, and Clara bustling with her trays. Beatrice was at the other end of the table, I think, laughing with some cousin or other. I didn't see anything amiss, but then I was rather absorbed in the locket's details." He chuckled, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes flicked to the side, as if revisiting a memory he preferred to keep private. "And your cigar," she said, her tone as light as ever. "You stepped out to fetch it, you said. That was during the main course, wasn't it? It must have been a quick errand." Her observation was gentle, but she watched him closely, noting the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "Yes, quite quick," he said, his voice steady but with a trace of caution. "I keep my cigars in my coat pocket, force of habit. I was gone only a minute, perhaps 2. The locket was still on Eleanor's neck when I returned. I'm certain of it." His certainty was firm, but Miss Marple remembered the chaos of the dining room at that moment, the clatter of plates, the hum of voices, the perfect cover for a deft hand. She nodded, her needles clicking as she drew out another stitch. "It's remarkable how much can happen in a moment, isn't it? A locket there 1 minute, gone the next. I wonder if someone might have used that bustle to their advantage." Her words were speculative, but they carried a weight that made Dr. Hayes pause, his fingers stilling on his beard. "Indeed," he said, his tone more guarded now. "It would take a bold thief, though, to act in such company. I'd wager it was an impulse, not a plan. Someone saw an opportunity and took it." His suggestion was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the way he steered the conversation away from himself, as if eager to shift suspicion elsewhere. The garden grew quieter as a cloud passed over the sun, casting a shadow over the roses. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "You're probably right," she said, her smile disarming. "Still, it's helpful to hear your perspective, Dr. Hayes. Your knowledge of the locket's value gives you a unique view. If anything else comes to mind, any small detail, you'll let me know, won't you?" Her request was polite, but her eyes held a quiet intensity, and Dr. Hayes nodded, his expression a mix of courtesy and caution. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, rising from the bench. "I'll keep my eyes open. For now, I think I'll take a turn through the garden, clear my head." He tipped his hat and strolled off, his figure receding among the rose bushes. Miss Marple remained on the bench, her mind sifting through the conversation. Dr. Hayes's fascination with the locket was undeniable, his knowledge almost too precise. His brief absence during dinner, though plausible, coincided with the critical window when the locket vanished. And there was that spark in his eyes when he spoke of it, a hunger that went beyond scholarship. She thought of her old friend Canon Pennyfather, whose passion for rare manuscripts had once led him into trouble, and wondered if Dr. Hayes's love for antiquities might have tipped into something more dangerous. The sun emerged again, casting a warm glow over the garden, and Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. Dr. Hayes was a man of intellect and charm, but charm, she knew, could hide many things. She would turn her attention to Beatrice next, for the cousin's brittle laughter and nervous gestures suggested a story yet to be told. Chapter 6. The Cousin's Facade. The terrace of Greystone Manor, bathed in the fading light of a late autumn afternoon, offered a commanding view of the estate's rolling lawns, now tinged with the russet hues of the season. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, stood near the balustrade, her knitting bag tucked beside her on a wrought-iron chair. She had chosen this open, airy spot to encounter Beatrice Lyle, knowing that the cousin's penchant for cigarettes would draw her here sooner or later. The terrace, with its flagstones and potted chrysanthemums, was a place where one might speak freely, or so Miss Marple hoped, for Beatrice's brittle demeanor at the gathering had not escaped her notice. As expected, Beatrice appeared, her crimson dress replaced by a more subdued ensemble of gray wool, though her scarf, a vivid splash of emerald green, betrayed her flair for the dramatic. She held a cigarette in a long holder, its tip glowing as she inhaled, and her eyes, sharp but shadowed, scanned the terrace before settling on Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying a forced brightness. "Taking the air? It's rather brisk out here, isn't it?" She laughed, a high, tinkling sound that seemed to crack at the edges, and moved to lean against the balustrade, her posture casual but tense. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she drew out a length of pale blue wool. "I find the fresh air sharpens the mind," she said, her tone as gentle as the breeze stirring the chrysanthemums. "And it's a fine view, don't you think? Greystone is such a splendid place, though I imagine it holds many memories for you, being family." Her words were an invitation, soft but deliberate, and she watched Beatrice's reaction, noting the way. Her fingers tightened around the cigarette holder. Beatrice exhaled a plume of smoke, her eyes drifting to the distant hills. "Oh, it's grand, all right," she said, her voice light but with a trace of bitterness. "I spent summers here as a girl, running wild with Charles and the others. But it's different now. Eleanor's the queen of the manor, and the rest of us are just visitors." Her words carried a hint of resentment, and Miss Marple tucked this away, like a dropped stitch to be examined later. "You must feel the loss of the locket keenly then," Miss Marple said, her voice sympathetic. "It's such a personal thing, a family treasure. I suppose you've seen it many times over the years?" Her question was posed with the innocence of idle chatter, but her eyes were sharp, catching the fleeting shadow that crossed Beatrice's face. Beatrice flicked ash over the balustrade, her movements quick and precise. "That old thing?" she said, her laugh sharp. "It's gaudy, if you ask me. All those emeralds and curlicues, more suited to a museum than a neck. But Eleanor loves it, so who am I to judge?" Her dismissal was airy, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her eyes darted away, as if reluctant to meet her gaze. She nodded, her needles moving steadily. "It does have a certain old-world charm," she said. "I understand you were quite the life of the party last night, dancing and mingling. It must be hard to keep track of everything in such a whirl." Her tone was admiring, but her words were a gentle probe, testing the waters of Beatrice's recollection. Beatrice's smile was tight, and she took another drag on her cigarette. "I suppose I was," she said. "I danced with Mr. Harrow. He's a dreadful bore, but a decent partner. I was at the far end of the dining room most of the evening, nowhere near Eleanor, too busy trying to keep the mood light." Her words were casual, but there was a defensive edge to them, and Miss Marple recalled seeing her slip toward the side of the room during dessert, her movements quick and almost furtive. "You didn't notice anything unusual then?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as soft as the fading light. "Someone near Lady Eleanor, perhaps, or anything out of place? It's such a mystery how a locket can vanish in a crowded room." Her question was innocent, but she watched Beatrice closely, noting the way. Her fingers trembled as she lit another cigarette. Beatrice shook her head, her scarf catching the breeze. "Not a thing," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "It was all a blur. Plates clattering, people talking over each other. Clara was rushing about, and Dr. Hayes was droning on about the locket's history, as usual. I was too busy enjoying myself to notice anything else." Her laugh was forced, and Miss Marple caught the nervous flick of her eyes toward the manor, as if she feared being overheard. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. "You've been in London recently, haven't you? I heard you mention it at dinner. It must be a change from the quiet of the countryside." Her comment was offhand, but she had chosen it carefully. Remembering Beatrice's casual remark about a recent trip and the odd detail that she had stayed at a modest hotel, unusual for someone who projected such an air of sophistication. Beatrice's smile faltered, and she stubbed out her cigarette with a sharp twist. "Yes, I was there last week," she said, her tone brisk. "Just a quick visit, some shopping, a bit of theater, nothing special." Her words were clipped, and she reached for another cigarette, her hands betraying a restlessness that Miss Marple found telling. A woman of Beatrice's apparent means, staying at a modest hotel, suggested constraints she was eager to conceal. "And you didn't happen to meet anyone who might know about antiques?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as ever. "The locket's value must be well known in certain circles. I wonder if someone outside the family might have taken an interest." Her suggestion was speculative, but she watched Beatrice's reaction, noting the sudden stillness in her posture. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, and for a moment her facade slipped, revealing a flash of unease. "I don't mix with that sort," she said quickly. "My friends are more the theater and cocktails crowd, not dusty old collectors." Her laugh was sharp, but it lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers fumbled with her lighter, as if her nerves were fraying. The terrace grew dim as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the flagstones. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Of course," she said, her smile disarming. "It's just that you have such a knack for people, Beatrice. If anyone saw something last night, I'm sure you'd have noticed, even if it seemed trivial at the time." Her words were encouraging, but her eyes held a quiet intensity, and Beatrice's expression wavered, a mix of defiance and doubt. "I told you, I was busy dancing," Beatrice said, her voice sharp now. "If you want to know what happened, ask Clara. She was the one skulking about with her trays, or Dr. Hayes with his nose practically in Eleanor's jewelry." Her tone was accusatory, and she turned away, exhaling smoke into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Thank you, Beatrice," she said softly. "You've been most helpful. If anything else comes to mind, you'll let me know, won't you?" Her request was polite, but it carried a weight that made Beatrice pause, her cigarette halfway to her lips. "Of course," Beatrice said, her voice tight. She offered a curt nod and strode back toward the manor, her scarf trailing like a banner of unease. Miss Marple remained on the terrace, her mind sifting through the conversation. Beatrice's dismissal of the locket as gaudy was at odds with her nervous demeanor, and her vague account of her movements during dinner raised questions. The mention of London and the modest hotel suggested financial strain, a detail that clashed with her polished exterior. Miss Marple thought of her friend Elspeth McGillicuddy, whose cousin had once fallen into debt over cards, hiding her shame behind a mask of gaiety. Beatrice, she suspected, was hiding something. Perhaps not the theft itself, but a truth that made her vulnerable. The evening air grew colder, and Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. The locket's disappearance was a knot to be untangled, and Beatrice's facade was a thread that might lead to its heart. Tomorrow, she would examine the clue she had found, the scuff mark and green wax near the servants' passage, and see where it led. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Dust. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Manor's dining room, casting a soft glow over the polished mahogany table and the heavy damask curtains that framed the view of the mist-draped lawns. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the quiet moments when observation yielded its richest rewards, had risen early to revisit the scene of the locket's disappearance. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a familiar companion, as she moved with deliberate care across the parquet floor, her eyes scanning for details overlooked in the chaos of the previous evening's search. The manor was still, save for the distant clatter of breakfast preparations in the kitchen, and Miss Marple relished the solitude, knowing it allowed her mind to work unhindered. She paused near the side door leading to the servants' passage, a narrow portal tucked behind a tapestry that depicted a pastoral scene. It was here, during the fruitless search after the locket's loss, that she had noticed something, a faint scuff mark on the polished floor, accompanied by a speck of green wax, no larger than a pinhead. Kneeling now, her joints protesting with a twinge she ignored, she examined the mark again. The scuff was slight, a smudge of dirt or boot polish that marred the gleaming wood, suggesting a hurried step. The wax, hardened and faintly translucent, matched the hue of the green tapers that had adorned the dining table during Lady Eleanor's birthday feast. Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought, her mind turning over the implications. Had someone brushed against a candle in haste, leaving this tiny trace as they slipped through the door? Rising, she pushed the tapestry aside and opened the side door, revealing a dim, narrow corridor used by the servants to move unobtrusively between rooms. The passage smelled of old stone and faintly of polish, and its flagstone floor bore no obvious marks, but Miss Marple noted a faint dusting of grit near the threshold, as if carried in on a shoe. The corridor led to a service stair, which in turn opened to the kitchen, and beyond that, a small door to the garden. She stepped carefully along the passage, her eyes sharp for any further clues, but found nothing more than a cobweb in a corner and the faint echo of her own footsteps. Still, the route was telling. A discreet exit, perfect for someone wishing to leave the dining room unnoticed during the bustle of dinner. Miss Marple returned to the dining room, her mind weaving a pattern from these small threads. The scuff mark and wax suggested movement, perhaps hurried, during the critical hour when the locket vanished, between the main course and dessert. The side door offered a swift escape, and the garden door beyond led to a path that wound to the village road. She thought of her own saint, Mary Mead, where a gardener's boy once used a back gate to slip away with a stolen watch, believing himself unseen. Human nature, she knew, was much the same in grand manners as in quiet villages. As she stood by the dining table, tracing the memory of the evening's seating, the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, entered, her apron crisp and her expression one of polite surprise. "Miss Marple," she said, "you're up early. Is there something you need?" Her tone was deferential, but her eyes held a flicker of curiosity, as if she sensed Miss Marple's purpose. Miss Marple smiled, her manner as unassuming as ever. "Just taking a turn about the room, Mrs. Gibbs," she said. "It's such a fine space, and I thought I might recall something from last night. The locket's disappearance is so puzzling, isn't it? I suppose the servants were all accounted for during dinner." Her question was posed lightly, but her gaze was steady, noting the housekeeper's reaction. Mrs. Gibbs nodded, her hands smoothing her apron. "Oh, yes, ma'am. The staff were run off their feet, what with all the guests. Clara was in and out, clearing plates, and the kitchen maids were busy with the cooking. No one had time to be anywhere they shouldn't." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple caught a slight hesitation, as if Mrs. Gibbs were reassuring herself as much as her listener. "And the side door here," Miss Marple said, gesturing toward the tapestry. "It's used often, I imagine, for quick trips to the kitchen. It must be a godsend during a large gathering." Her tone was conversational, but she watched Mrs. Gibbs closely, noting the way her eyes flicked to the door. "It is, ma'am," Mrs. Gibbs said. "Clara used it several times last night, and the footman Tom as well. It's the quickest way to the kitchen without crossing the main hall." Her answer was straightforward, but Miss Marple sensed a protective note, as if the housekeeper were shielding her staff from suspicion. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she drew them from her bag, a pretext for lingering. "Of course," she said. "It's such a well-run house. I suppose no strangers were about last night, no delivery men or unexpected callers." Her question was casual, but she was testing the possibility of an outsider, someone who might have used the passage to slip in and out. Mrs. Gibbs shook her head, her expression firm. "No, ma'am. The gates were locked, and the staff would have noticed anyone out of place. It was just the family and guests." Her certainty was convincing, but Miss Marple filed it away, knowing that assumptions could blind even the most diligent to the truth. As Mrs. Gibbs excused herself to oversee the breakfast preparations, Miss Marple took a final turn about the dining room, her eyes lingering on the candelabra that had held the green tapers. One was slightly askew, its base bearing a faint smear of wax, as if it had been nudged. She thought of the guests, Charles with his restless ambition, Clara with her nervous glances, Dr. Hayes with his scholarly obsession, and Beatrice with her brittle facade. Any of them could have used the side door, brushing against the candle in their haste. But why? And to what end? She stepped out into the hall, her mind turning to the garden path beyond the servants' passage. It led to a small gate, half hidden by laurels, that opened onto the village road. A discreet route, she mused, for someone with something to hide. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poacher had used a similar back path to smuggle game, thinking himself clever until a single footprint gave him away. The locket, she suspected, had not left Greystone far, if it had left at all. As she made her way to the morning room, intending to jot down her thoughts, she encountered Lady Eleanor, who was descending the staircase, her face pale but composed. "Jane," Eleanor said, her voice warm but tinged with worry. "Have you found anything? I hardly slept, thinking of that locket." Her hand touched her throat where the heirloom had hung for so many years. Miss Marple smiled, her manner reassuring. "Nothing certain yet, Eleanor," she said, "but I've found a small clue that may help. A scuff mark and a bit of wax near the side door, suggesting someone moved quickly during dinner. It's a start, at least." Her words were measured, revealing just enough to comfort without betraying her full suspicions. Eleanor's eyes widened, a spark of hope in them. "You're a marvel, Jane," she said. "I knew you'd see what we've all missed. Will you keep looking?" Her plea was earnest, and Miss Marple nodded, her resolve firm. "Of course," she said, her voice steady. "We'll find it, Eleanor. These things have a way of coming to light." As Eleanor thanked her and moved toward the breakfast room, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the clue in the dust. It was a small thing, but in her experience, small things often led to great truths. She would visit the village next to see if the locket, or its thief, had left any trace beyond the manor's walls. Chapter 8. The Village Connection. The village of Greystone, a cluster of stone cottages and winding lanes nestled in the shadow of the manor, hummed with the quiet rhythm of rural life. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, made her way along the cobbled high street, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the stones. The morning was crisp, with a faint mist lingering in the air, and she had chosen to walk to the village under the guise of posting a letter, though her true purpose was to seek out the whispers that always swirled in small communities after a scandal. The locket's disappearance was surely the talk of Greystone, and Miss Marple knew that village gossip, like the threads in her knitting, could reveal patterns invisible to those too close to see. Her destination was the Black Swan, the village pub, a timbered building with a sagging roof and a sign that creaked in the breeze. It was the heart of local chatter, where tongues loosened over pints of ale and news traveled faster than the post. As she entered, the warm scent of wood smoke and hops greeted her, along with the low murmur of voices from a handful of patrons. The landlord, a burly man named Ted Grayson with a ruddy face and a ready smile, was polishing glasses behind the bar. He recognized Miss Marple from her occasional visits with Lady Eleanor and greeted her with a nod. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice jovial. "Bit early for a pint, but I've got tea if you're inclined." Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a stool at the bar, her knitting bag resting beside her. "A cup of tea would be lovely, Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone as warm as the fire crackling in the corner. "I'm just passing through, posting a letter, but I thought I'd stop in. The village seems abuzz with talk of Lady Eleanor's locket, doesn't it?" Her question was posed with the casual interest of an outsider, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Grayson's hands paused on the glass he was polishing. "Aye, it's all anyone's talking about," Grayson said, setting a steaming cup before her. "A shame, that, a fine piece like that going missing. Folk here reckon it's worth a king's ransom, with those emeralds and all." He leaned forward, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Some say it was one of the guests, others think a servant got sticky fingers. What do you make of it, miss? You're staying up at the manor, aren't you?" His curiosity was genuine, and Miss Marple sensed an opportunity to draw out more. "Oh, I'm just a guest myself," she said, her voice modest. "But it's a puzzle, isn't it? Such a thing vanishing in a crowded room? I suppose no one's seen anything unusual in the village? Strangers about, perhaps, or someone acting out of character?" Her question was light, but she watched Grayson closely, noting the way. His eyes flicked toward a corner table where two older men sat nursing their pints. Grayson hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice a near whisper. "Well, since you ask, there's been talk about Miss Beatrice Lyle. She was seen here a few days back, before the party, with a fellow named Tommy Vance. Not the sort you'd expect her to keep company with, if you take my meaning." He raised an eyebrow, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained one of polite surprise. "Tommy Vance?" she repeated, as if the name were new to her. "I don't believe I've heard of him. Is he a local?" Her tone was innocent, but her mind was already weaving connections, recalling Beatrice's nervous demeanor and her vague account of her London trip. Grayson nodded, wiping the bar with a cloth. "Aye, he's local enough, but not the respectable sort. Runs a pawn shop down by the river. Deals in odds and ends, but folks say he's not above fencing stolen goods if the price is right. Helps pay off gambling debts, they say, for those who've fallen on hard times." He paused, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. Miss Beatrice was seen with him at the back of the pub, heads together like they were planning something. Looked proper anxious, she did. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "How curious," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I suppose she might have been discussing some family matter. She's a cousin of the Wentworths, isn't she?" Her question was designed to keep Grayson talking, and he took the bait, leaning forward again. "Cousin, aye, but not close," he said. "She's been coming and going from Greystone for years, always dressed to the nines but short on cash if you believe the talk. Folk reckon she's got herself in a spot of trouble. Cards or horses, maybe. Vance is the sort who'd help her out, for a price." His tone was heavy with implication, and Miss Marple noted the detail, her mind turning to Beatrice's brittle laughter and the modest hotel she'd mentioned. She tilted her head as if musing on his words. "It's surprising, isn't it, how people can get themselves into such tangles. I suppose no one's seen this Mr. Vance since the party, or anything that might connect to the locket?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes were alert, catching the slight stiffening in Grayson's posture. "Not that I've heard," he said, his voice cautious now. "Vance keeps to himself, mostly, but he's been in the pub since, same as always. If he's got the locket, he's not flashing it about." He chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it, and Miss Marple wondered if he knew more than he was letting on. As she finished her tea, a woman entered the pub, a stout, middle-aged figure in a sensible coat, her face flushed from the cold. Mrs. Carter, the village postmistress, greeted Grayson with a nod, and Miss Marple with a smile. "Miss Marple," she said, "you're a long way from St. Mary Mead. Come about that locket business, I'll wager." Her tone was friendly but pointed, and Miss Marple sensed another source of village insight. "Just posting a letter," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But I confess I'm curious about the talk. Mr. Grayson was just telling me about a Mr. Vance. You must hear all sorts in the post office, Mrs. Carter." Her words were an invitation, and Mrs. Carter, ever eager to share, settled onto a stool beside her. "Oh, Vance is a sly one," Mrs. Carter said, her voice low but eager. "I saw Miss Beatrice with him myself, day before the party, outside his shop. She looked proper upset, handing him something. Couldn't see what, but it was small, wrapped in cloth. I thought it odd, her being family and all." Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of gossip, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. "How interesting," she said, her needles moving steadily. "It's probably nothing, but these little things do catch one's attention. No one's mentioned seeing the locket itself, I suppose." Her question was casual, but she watched Mrs. Carter closely, noting the quick shake of her head. "Not a peep," Mrs. Carter said. "But if it's gone, Vance's shop is where I'd look. He's got a knack for making things disappear." She lowered her voice further. "And Miss Beatrice, well, she's not been herself lately, always on that phone of hers, looking like she's waiting for bad news." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Carter and Grayson, leaving a coin for the tea and stepping back into the chilly high street. Her mind was alive with possibilities. Beatrice's connection to Tommy Vance, a man known for fencing stolen goods, was a thread that tied her to the locket's disappearance. The meeting before the party, the small package, her nervous demeanor, all pointed to a woman in distress, perhaps driven by debts she could not pay. Miss Marple thought of her old friend Mrs. Bantry, whose nephew had once sold a family ring to cover gambling losses, only to regret it bitterly. Beatrice, she suspected, was caught in a similar web, but whether she had taken the locket herself or passed it to Vance remained unclear. As she walked back to the manor, the mist curling around her like a cloak, Miss Marple resolved to watch Beatrice more closely. The village had given her a clue. But it was the manner, its secrets, and its silences that would reveal the truth. She would speak to Eleanor next, to gauge her cousin's behavior, and perhaps set a trap to draw the thief into the open. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The late afternoon at Greystone Manor carried a hushed expectancy, as if the very walls anticipated the next move in the unfolding drama of the stolen locket. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with its soft light filtering through lace curtains, had requested a private word with Lady Eleanor Wentworth. Her knitting lay in her lap, a quiet companion to her thoughts, which were as intricate as the pattern she worked. The clue of the scuff mark and green wax, combined with the village gossip about Beatrice Lyle's association with Tommy Vance, had sharpened her focus. Now she needed a strategy to stir the waters and see what surfaced. A trap, delicately set, might coax the thief, or their accomplice, into revealing themselves. Eleanor entered, her silver hair catching the light, her expression a blend of weariness and resolve. She wore a simple brooch in place of the missing locket, a poignant reminder of the loss. "Jane," she said, settling into a chair opposite, "you've been so kind to take this matter to heart. Have you found anything new?" Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted a handkerchief, betraying her unease. Miss Marple set her needles aside, her smile warm but purposeful. "A few small things, Eleanor," she said, her tone reassuring. "Nothing certain yet, but I've an idea that might help. Sometimes a little misdirection can bring the truth to light. What if we were to announce that the locket has been found, damaged perhaps, but recovered, and will be sent for repair? It might prompt someone to act, thinking their secret safe." Her suggestion was delivered with the calm of a seasoned strategist, and she watched Eleanor's reaction, noting the spark of intrigue in her eyes. Eleanor leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "A trap, you mean? To see who reacts?" She paused, considering, then nodded slowly. "It's clever, Jane. If the thief believes the locket's found, they might betray themselves, perhaps try to retrieve it or cover their tracks. But how do we spread the news without it seeming contrived?" Her question was practical, and Miss Marple admired her quick grasp of the plan. "Leave that to me," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "A word here and there, dropped casually among the household, will do the trick. Servants talk, and guests overhear. By dinner, everyone will know. We'll watch closely, you and I, for any sign of unease." Her eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, and Eleanor managed a small smile, a flicker of hope amidst her worry. They agreed to act that evening, during the informal gathering planned for the remaining guests. Miss Marple suggested Eleanor make the announcement herself, in a tone of relief tinged with concern, to lend it authenticity. As Eleanor left to prepare, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind mapping out the likely reactions. Charles, with his financial ambitions, might show relief or irritation. Clara, with her nervous glances, might reveal guilt or fear. Dr. Hayes, with his scholarly fascination, might betray disappointment or curiosity, and Beatrice, with her village connection to Tommy Vance, might act in a way that confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. By evening, the drawing room was alight with the glow of lamps and the murmur of conversation. The guests, fewer now as some had departed, mingled with a forced cheerfulness, the locket's absence a shadow over the gathering. Charles stood by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in hand, his smile tight as he spoke to a distant cousin. Clara moved silently, replenishing a tray of biscuits, her eyes darting to the door. Dr. Hayes sat near a bookcase, leafing through a volume on French antiquities, his expression absorbed but alert. Beatrice, in a dress of deep blue, smoked a cigarette by the window, her posture rigid despite her casual air. Eleanor, entering with a quiet grace, drew the room's attention. "My dears," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of relief. "I have some news. The locket has been found, tucked behind a cushion in the dining room, though I'm afraid it's damaged. The clasp is broken, and one emerald is loose. I'll send it to a jeweler in London tomorrow for repair." Her words were met with murmurs of surprise and congratulations, but Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner, watched the suspects with the keenness of a hawk. Charles's shoulders relaxed visibly, and he raised his glass in a toast. "That's splendid, Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice warm but with a trace of strain. "A relief to have it back, even if it needs fixing." His smile was broad, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to Beatrice, a fleeting glance that carried a hint of wariness. Clara, pausing with her tray, looked confused, her brow furrowing as if struggling to process the news. "Found, my lady?" she said softly, then caught herself, resuming her task with a flush creeping up her neck. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the way her hands trembled as she set down the tray, as if the announcement had unsettled her. Dr. Hayes closed his book with a snap, his expression one of mild disappointment. "A pity about the damage," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Those emeralds are delicate. 18th century settings often are. I'd be happy to recommend a jeweler, Eleanor, one skilled in such pieces." His offer was gracious, but Miss Marple caught the intensity in his gaze, as if he longed to see the locket again. Beatrice, by the window, went pale, her cigarette trembling in its holder. "Found?" she echoed, her voice sharp before she softened it with a laugh. "Well, that's a stroke of luck, isn't it? I must make a call. Excuse me." She stubbed out her cigarette and moved toward the door, her steps quick and unsteady. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind alert to Beatrice's reaction, which was more pronounced than the others. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple slipped away to confer with Eleanor in the library. Beatrice's response was telling, she said, her voice low. "She's anxious, perhaps fearing the locket's recovery will expose her. I've a suspicion she's connected to a man in the village, Tommy Vance, who deals in questionable goods. If you'll permit it, I'd like to ask the village constable to keep an eye on Vance's shop tonight." Her suggestion was measured, but her eyes were sharp, and Eleanor nodded, her trust in Miss Marple absolute. "I'll telephone Constable Reed at once," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "If Beatrice is involved, we must know. Oh, Jane, I hate to think it of family, but I trust your judgment." Her hand touched Miss Marple's arm, a gesture of gratitude and resolve. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her knitting a pretext for observation. Beatrice had not returned, and a discreet inquiry to the butler revealed she had taken her coat and left the manor, citing a need for air. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her village, where a young woman once fled a confrontation, only to betray her guilt by her haste. Beatrice, she suspected, was on her way to Vance, perhaps to warn him or retrieve the locket before its supposed repair. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her needles clicking steadily. The trap was set, and now she must wait to see who stumbled into it. Beatrice's pale face and hurried exit were threads in the pattern, and the village connection to Tommy Vance was a knot that might soon unravel. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose keen eye for human folly had often mirrored her own, and resolved to watch closely, for the truth was near. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The night air hung heavy over Greystone Village, its cobbled streets slick with the damp of an autumn evening. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, stood in the shadow of a yew tree near the village square, her presence unobtrusive, but her senses alert. She had accompanied Constable Reed, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, to Tommy Vance's pawnshop, a squat building by the river with a flickering lantern above its door. The trap set earlier that evening, Lady Eleanor's announcement that the locket had been found had stirred Beatrice Lyle into action, and Miss Marple's instincts told her the cousin's hurried departure from the manor was no mere coincidence. Her knitting bag, a familiar prop, rested at her side, but her mind was far from the gentle rhythm of her needles, focused instead on the drama about to unfold. Constable Reed, briefed by Eleanor and guided by Miss Marple's quiet suggestions, had positioned himself near the shop's entrance, hidden by a stack of crates. Miss Marple, at his insistence, remained at a safe distance, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. The shop's window glowed faintly, casting a dim light on the street, and from within came the low murmur of voices. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the anticipation of truth revealed, for she knew that secrets, like moths, were drawn to the light of exposure. The door creaked open, and Beatrice Lyle emerged, her emerald scarf a vivid splash against the darkness. She clutched a small bundle, her movements furtive as she glanced up and down the street. Behind her, Tommy Vance, a wiry man with a sharp face and restless eyes, followed, his voice low but urgent. "You're sure it's safe?" he was saying, his tone laced with suspicion. "If they've found it, we're in trouble, B." His familiarity with Beatrice confirmed the village gossip, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, as if he sensed a trap closing. Before Beatrice could reply, Constable Reed stepped forward, his lantern raised. "Miss Lyle, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'll need to see what you're carrying, if you please." His sudden appearance startled Beatrice, who gasped and dropped the bundle, which fell with a soft thud on the cobbles. Vance froze, his eyes darting to the shadows, and Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence quiet but undeniable. Beatrice's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. "It's nothing, Constable," she said, her voice high and brittle. Just some old trinkets I was asking Mr. Vance to value." Her attempt at nonchalance was feeble, and Miss Marple, standing beside Reed, saw the glint of gold peeking from the cloth bundle at Beatrice's feet. Reed knelt, unwrapping the bundle with deliberate care. There, nestled in a scrap of velvet, was the antique locket, its emeralds catching the lantern's light like tiny stars. Eleanor's initials, etched in delicate filigree, confirmed its identity. Beatrice's breath caught, and she took a step back, her eyes wide with panic. Vance, his face hardening, muttered something under his breath, but Reed's stern glance silenced him. "Miss Lyle," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unyielding, "perhaps you'd care to explain how Lady Eleanor's locket came to be in your possession." Her question was posed with the kindness of an old friend, but it carried the weight of inevitability. And Beatrice's shoulders slumped, her facade crumbling like dry leaves. I didn't mean for it to go this far," Beatrice said, her voice breaking. It was a moment's madness. I took it during dinner. Eleanor was distracted, laughing with Mrs. Harrow, and I slipped it from her neck. The clasp was loose, and it was so easy. Her words tumbled out, a confession born of desperation. I owed money, gambling debts, more than I could ever pay. Tommy said he could sell it, clear my slate. I didn't think anyone would suspect me. Tears welled in her eyes, and she clutched her scarf as if it could shield her from the truth. Vance, his expression sour, tried to interject. "She came to me, Constable," he said, his voice sharp. "I didn't know it was stolen, not at first. I was just doing a favor." His protest was unconvincing, and Reed's skeptical frown made it clear he wasn't fooled. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "You knew, Mr. Vance," she said quietly. "The village speaks of your dealings, and Miss Lyle's visit to your shop before the party suggests you were expecting something valuable. The locket was no surprise to you." Her words were calm, but they cut through Vance's bravado, and he looked away, his jaw tight. Reed pocketed the locket, his manner brisk. "You'll both come with me to the station," he said. "There'll be questions, and Lady Eleanor will need to decide what's to be done." He gestured for Beatrice and Vance to move, and Beatrice, her defiance spent, followed meekly, her head bowed. Vance, muttering under his breath, went along, his eyes darting for an escape that wasn't there. As Reed escorted them to his car, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning over the confession. Beatrice's desperation was genuine, her remorse palpable, but the ease with which she had taken the locket spoke of a reckless impulse, born of a life teetering on the edge. Miss Marple thought of her neighbor in St. Mary Mead, young Elsie, who had once pilfered a brooch to impress a suitor, only to be undone by her own guilt. Human nature, she mused, was as predictable as it was frail. She returned to the manor under a sky pricked with stars, her knitting bag a comforting weight at her side. Eleanor was waiting in the hall, her face pale but composed as Miss Marple recounted the evening's events. "Beatrice," Eleanor murmured, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I never thought, but I suppose I should have seen her struggle. She was always so proud, so unwilling to ask for help." Her hand touched the spot where the locket had hung, a gesture of loss and forgiveness. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. "She's sorry, Eleanor," she said, "and I believe her remorse is real. What you do next is for you to decide, but I think she needs help, not punishment." Her advice was gentle, but it carried the weight of experience, and Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. As they parted, Miss Marple retired to her room, her mind already sifting through the remaining threads of the case. Beatrice's confession had resolved the locket's fate, but the reactions of the others, Charles, Clara, Dr. Hayes, needed to be examined to ensure no other secrets lingered. The night was still, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm, stitching together the final pieces of the puzzle. Chapter 11. The Motives Unraveled. The morning room of Greystone Manor, with its soft light filtering through lace curtains, was a haven of calm after the tumult of the previous night's confrontation. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting a gentle rhythm in her hands, as she prepared to share her findings with the gathered household. Lady Eleanor Wentworth, her silver hair neatly pinned, occupied the central chair, her expression a blend of relief and lingering sorrow. The locket, now safely returned, rested on a velvet cushion beside her, its emeralds catching the morning sun like fragments of a forgotten summer. Charles Wentworth, Clara the maid, and Dr. Lionel Hayes were present, each seated with varying degrees of unease, while Beatrice Lyle, still shaken from her confession, had been excused to rest under the watchful eye of the housekeeper. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved from face to face, noting the subtle currents of tension that lingered despite the locket's recovery. She had requested this gathering to lay bare the threads of the mystery, not only to clarify Beatrice's guilt, but to ensure no other secrets festered in the shadows of Greystone. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle, but carried the quiet authority of one who had unraveled many such tangles before. "My dear Eleanor," she began, her needles pausing, "the locket is back where it belongs, and for that we are all grateful. But I thought it best to explain how it came to be taken, and why, so that we may put this matter to rest." She smiled, her manner reassuring, but her gaze was steady, inviting no interruption. Eleanor nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "Please, Jane," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to understand Beatrice's actions. They've shaken us all." Her eyes flicked to the locket, a silent acknowledgment of its weight in the family's history. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly as she began. "The locket's disappearance was no accident," she said. "It was taken during dinner, in a moment of opportunity, by someone who knew its value and saw a chance to act. Beatrice, as we now know, was that person. Her confession last night, witnessed by Constable Reed and myself, revealed her motive: gambling debts that had spiraled beyond her control. She saw the locket as a means to settle her obligations with Tommy Vance, a man known in the village for fencing goods to those in need of quick cash. Her words were measured, painting a picture without judgment, and she noted the way Charles shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening on the armrest. "But let us go back to that evening," she continued, her tone calm but deliberate. The dining room was alive with conversation, plates clattering, guests moving about. Beatrice, seated at the far end, had been dancing and mingling, but she found a moment when Eleanor was distracted, laughing with Mrs. Harrow, I believe, to slip close and undo the locket's clasp. It was a bold act, but desperation makes one bold. She used the side door to the servants' passage, brushing against a candelabra in her haste, leaving a scuff mark and a speck of green wax that I found the next day. Her eyes flicked to the door in question, now innocuous in the morning light, and she saw Clara's gaze drop, her hands twisting in her apron. Charles cleared his throat, his voice tight. "It's shocking, of course, but I'm glad it's settled. Beatrice always had a reckless streak. I suppose we should have seen it coming." His words were reasonable, but Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his cheeks, a sign of discomfort that suggested he was not entirely at ease. She tilted her head, her smile gentle but probing. "Indeed, Charles," she said, "but I confess I looked at you, too, as a possibility. Your plans to modernize Greystone are ambitious, and the locket's value could have eased your financial strain. Your movements during dinner were vague, near the sideboard, you said, but not always in sight. And your suit, I noticed, had frayed cuffs, a small sign of economies that might tempt one to act rashly." Her observation was delivered with kindness, but Charles stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "I'd never touch Aunt Eleanor's locket," he said, his voice sharp. "Greystone is my responsibility, yes, but I'd sell my own things before I'd stoop to theft." His indignation was convincing, and Miss Marple nodded, satisfied that his ambition, while real, had not crossed into crime. Turning to Clara, she softened her tone. "And you, Clara, gave me pause with your nervousness. Your hands trembled during dinner, and you slipped into the servants' passage more than once, using that same door. I wondered if you might have seen something, or done something, out of fear or loyalty. Your time at Ashby Hall came to mind, with its history of a theft, but I see now your unease was fear of losing your place, not guilt." Her words were gentle, and Clara's eyes filled with tears, her head nodding in silent relief. Dr. Hayes, who had been listening intently, stroked his beard, his expression one of scholarly detachment. "A fascinating unravelling, Miss Marple," he said. "I suppose my own interest in the locket made me a suspect, too." His tone was light, but his eyes were wary, and Miss Marple smiled, her gaze steady. "Your knowledge of the locket was remarkable, Doctor." "Hayes," she said, "you spoke of its history with such passion, and your brief absence during dinner, to fetch a cigar, you said, coincided with the critical moment. I wondered if your scholarly love might have tipped into something more possessive. But your disappointment at the false news of the locket's recovery was that of a man who valued its study, not its possession." Her assessment was precise, and Hayes inclined his head, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Miss Marple turned back to Eleanor, her voice warm. Beatrice's motive was clear, debts that overwhelmed her pride. The scuff mark and wax confirmed her path through the side door, and her meeting with Vance, observed in the village, sealed her intent. She acted alone, I believe, driven by desperation, not malice. Her words were a balm, offering clarity without cruelty, and Eleanor's shoulders relaxed, though her eyes remained sad. "Thank you, Jane," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "You've given us the truth, and that's more than I dared hope. I'll speak to Beatrice. She needs help, not condemnation. The locket is back, and that's what matters." Her hand rested on the velvet cushion, a gesture of reclaiming what was hers. As the others rose, murmuring their thanks, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind at ease, but still alert. The motives had been unraveled, the threads of suspicion neatly tied, but she thought of her village, where truths often lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for a final tug to bring them fully to light. For now, Greystone was at peace, and she was content to let it be. Chapter 12. The Locket Restored. The sun rose over Greystone Manor with a gentle warmth, casting a golden glow across the dew-kissed lawns and softening the stark lines of the ancient stone facade. Inside, the morning room was quiet, its lace curtains stirring faintly in the breeze from an open window. Lady Eleanor Wentworth sat at a small table, the antique locket once more around her neck, its emeralds gleaming like fragments of a verdant past. The weight of the past day's turmoil seemed to lift in the soft light, though a shadow of sadness lingered in her eyes. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, joined her for a final cup of tea before her departure to St. Mary Mead, her mission at Greystone complete, but her thoughts still weaving through the delicate threads of human nature. Eleanor's fingers brushed the locket, a gesture both tender and resolute. "Jane," she said, her voice steady but warm with gratitude, "you've given me back more than this locket. You've given us clarity and perhaps a chance to mend what's been broken. I can't thank you enough." Her smile was genuine, though tinged with the weight of recent revelations, and she poured tea with the grace of one accustomed to carrying burdens lightly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, her needles clicking softly as she drew out a length of pale blue wool. "It's no more than anyone might do, Eleanor," she said, her tone modest but firm. "People are often their own worst enemies, aren't they? A little observation, a touch of patience, and the truth usually finds its way out." Her words were simple, but they carried the wisdom of countless mysteries unraveled, from the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead to the grand halls of Greystone. Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where the gardens stretched toward the horizon. "Beatrice," she said softly, "I've decided not to press charges. She's family, after all, and her remorse is real. I've arranged for her to see a counselor in London, someone who can help with her gambling. I hope it's not too late for her to start anew." Her voice held a note of hope, tempered by the realism of one who knew family ties could bind as much as they healed. Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression kind but thoughtful. "A wise choice, Eleanor," she said. "Beatrice acted out of desperation, not malice. I've seen it before, in my village. A young man, not unlike Beatrice, who took a silver spoon to pay a debt, only to find the shame heavier than the coin. Help, not punishment, is what she needs." Her words were a gentle echo of her earlier advice, and she noted the relief in Eleanor's posture, as if a final knot had been untied. The locket, now restored to its rightful place, seemed to gleam with renewed significance. Miss Marple's mind turned briefly to the others. Charles, whose ambition had been tempered by the scare of suspicion, Clara, whose nervous loyalty had been reassured, and Dr. Hayes, whose scholarly passion had been cleared of darker motives. Each had been touched by the locket's loss, their secrets laid bare by the simple act of observation. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose tales of village scandals often mirrored the dramas of grander settings, and smiled at the universality of human folly. As they finished their tea, Eleanor rose, her hand extended. "You must come back, Jane," she said, her voice earnest. "Not for mysteries, but for friendship. Greystone will always have a place for you." Her invitation was heartfelt, and Miss Marple clasped her hand, her smile warm. "I'd like that, Eleanor," she said, "though I suspect Greystone will be quieter now." Her eyes twinkled, and Eleanor laughed, a sound that lightened the room. An hour later, Miss Marple stood at the Manor's front steps, her suitcase packed and her knitting bag slung over her arm. The village taxi, a battered but reliable affair, waited to take her to the station. Charles, Clara, and Dr. Hayes had come to see her off, each offering polite farewells, though their expressions carried the weight of lessons learned. Charles's smile was less strained, Clara's hands steadier, and Hayes's nod held a touch of admiration. Beatrice, still resting, sent her apologies through the housekeeper, a gesture Miss Marple accepted with a nod. As the taxi trundled down the drive, Miss Marple gazed out at the passing countryside, her mind reflecting on the fragility of trust in families. The locket, a symbol of heritage, had revealed the cracks beneath Greystone's polished surface, cracks that, with care, might mend. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where her own small world awaited, with its gossip and its secrets, no less intricate for their simplicity. Her needles, tucked safely in her bag, would resume their work, just as her mind would turn to the next puzzle life might bring. The train station appeared, its platform bustling with the quiet rhythm of rural travel. Miss Marple boarded her carriage, her thoughts as precise as the stitches she would soon cast on. The locket was restored, the truth uncovered, and Greystone Manor could heal. For now, she was content to return home, where the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead held mysteries of their own, waiting to be unraveled.